Before kings feasted and knights rode in glory, peasants scraped by, digging roots, boiling bones, and living off the land. These meals weren't born of luxury, but of desperation and grit, passed down through soot-blackened pots and fire-warmed hearths. These are not delicacies from the noble's table. They are survival stories, written in cabbage leaves and barley gruel. And though history forgot them, they fed the hands that built the castles and sowed the fields. Let us begin. Meal. Pottage, the eternal stew. No meal better defined the medieval peasant's life than pottage. It wasn't a dish with a recipe, it was a living brew. Barley, oats, cabbage, onions, and herbs were thrown into an ever-boiling pot that rarely went cold. Each day, something new was added. Each night, it simmered again. Sometimes a stray bone or pork rind gave it flavor. Other times, it was just greenish broth thickened with grain. There was no end to pottage. Families didn't serve it. They sustained it, as if it were part of the household. It fed children, travelers, field hands. It was the backdrop to famine and feast alike. Pottage wasn't just food. It was time in a bowl. Each bite held yesterday's hunger and tomorrow's hope. A pot of pottage was often the heart of the home, hanging over the hearth, crusted with soot and history. Villagers would whisper of households where the same pot had simmered for generations, a broth born from centuries of hunger. When famine came, they'd water it down, praying it still nourished. But if pottage was survival simmered over time, what came next was bitter, dry, and scraped from the forest floor. Meal 2. Acorn bread. Hunger's last resort. When fields failed and taxes bit deep, peasants turned to the forest, and there they found acorns, bitter, stubborn, but plentiful. To make them edible, peasants soaked them in streams for days, or boiled them again and again to leach the tannins. The resulting mash was dried and ground into a rough meal, then baked into dark, bitter loaves. Acorn bread broke teeth and spirits. It was foul and dry, but it filled the belly when no grain could be had. Mothers chewed it soft for infants. Old men gnawed it slow, staring into the fire. It was famine's bread, a loaf of survival, not of comfort. It had no yeast, no joy, no scent of warmth, only the coarse reminder that the earth, when pushed, could still provide. In bad years, entire villages survived on nothing else, the sound of grinding acorns echoing through the woods. It was the forest's charity, harsh, slow, and barely enough. And yet, even acorn bread had weight. The next meal had little substance at all, but it warmed the bones just enough to keep moving. Meal 3. Barley gruel, the dawn meal. At first light before the fields beckoned, peasants began their day with barley gruel. Thin, bland, and barely warm, it was made by boiling ground barley in water. If they were lucky, a drop of honey or a handful of berries sweetened the pot. But most mornings, it was just water, salt, and grain. Gruel was the food of infants, elders, and anyone too poor to eat bread. It slid easily down tired throats and rested heavy in empty stomachs. It was humble, forgettable, and absolutely essential. It left no smell in the room, no mark on the pot, but it quieted hunger just enough to work. Some stirred it with carved spoons, others drank it straight from clay bowls. In monasteries, it was served in silence. In hovels, it was slurped beside cold ashes and damp straw. But when spring stirred the soil, a new kind of nourishment rose, stinging, wild, and full of life. Meal 4. Nettle soup, spring's first gift. After winter's hunger, before gardens grew, nettles brought life back to the village. Their sting vanished in boiling water, revealing a tender, iron-rich green that peasants knew well. Combined with wild garlic, onions, or a few scraps of bacon fat, nettle soup offered rare nutrition at a desperate time. Nettles, once a threat to bare skin, became the healer of spring. In pain, they punished. In hunger, they saved. Families gathered nettles with care, teaching children to pluck them in gloves or with folded cloth. The soup was hot, green, and sharp. And after a long winter, It tasted like resurrection. In some parts, midwives swore by it to help mothers regain strength. Old healers claimed it cleansed the blood and chased death from the lungs. But to the poor, it was simply edible, green, and available, and that was enough. Still, a peasant couldn't live on greens alone, and when even meat was a memory, the next best thing came from a bulb in the dirt, and a pot on the boil. Meal 5. Onion and leek broth, the warm breath of the earth. Bulbs like onions, leeks, and shallots were easy to store and simple to grow. When meat was gone and bread was thin, onion and leek broth was the only warmth left. Boiled slowly with herbs, if any could be found, and thickened with bread crusts, this broth was ladled out in wooden bowls and eaten slowly, with steam rising into frost-bitten air. It was poor in substance, rich in comfort. The broth filled the lungs and stirred the spirit. It wasn't a meal to remember, but it was one to endure by. The scent alone, sweet and sharp, was often enough to bring children to the hearth, eyes wide, bellies groaning. Some would chew the boiled onion whole, savoring its softness like meat. Others dipped stale rye bread, soaking in what little luxury the garden gave. But when the frost dug deeper and even onions grew scarce, peasants turned to the one root that never failed, hard, pale, and waiting beneath the snow. Meal 6. Turnip mash, the root beneath our feet. Before potatoes ever touched European soil, the turnip was the peasant's champion. Boiled soft and mashed with goat milk, curd, or lard, it made a filling, if bland, meal. Turnips grew in cold, poor soil and needed little tending. They fed families when grain failed and meat was a fantasy. Mash was served warm, often plain, sometimes with garlic or sour curd stirred in. The smell was earthy, and the taste, forgettable. But in the dead of winter, with a blizzard howling outside, a bowl of turnip mash meant one thing: you'd live another day. Sometimes the turnip was roasted in ashes to coax out sweetness. When salt was available, it was a treasure. Children would sigh at the taste, not because it was good, but because it wasn't worse. In the poorest homes, this root mash was the feast. Still, no root could match the richness of what lay inside the bone, if one could get their hands on it. Meal 7. Bone broth, hunger's ghost. In a world where meat was rare and scraps scarcer still, even bones were precious. Peasants scavenged bones from butcher's waste or were gifted leftovers from the manor kitchen. These were boiled for hours, sometimes days, with onions, roots, or just salt, until every last trace of marrow and fat dissolved into the water. The result? Bone broth, a thin golden liquid with healing warmth and haunting richness. Mothers fed it to the sick. Laborers sipped it before long days. Elders stirred it with trembling hands, remembering better meals long gone. To the poor, even a bone was a banquet waiting to be coaxed from the dead. In lean years, broth was served in silence. The greasy sheen on its surface was the only sign of nourishment. Children sucked the hollow bones afterward, hunting for the last morsel of marrow. The pot was never rinsed. Each batch clung to the ghosts of meals before. And when there were no bones, there were always beans, humble, dry, and dependable. Meal 8. Pea and lentil mash, the filling pulse. Dried peas and lentils were a blessing to the medieval poor. They kept through winter, grew in poor soil, and swelled generously when boiled. This mash, sometimes called a pulse, was made by boiling legumes into a thick, spoon-standing paste. Salt was rare. Lard was a miracle. Usually, it was just peas, water, and a prayer. Yet it filled the belly, and that mattered most. Served alone or spread on bread, this mash kept workers upright and children growing. Monks often survived on it during long fasts. It was humble, reliable, and surprisingly rich in strength. In monasteries, it was eaten in rows, heads bowed. In villages, it was mashed with bare hands and seasoned with hunger. When times were better, a chopped onion might join the pot, transforming it from mere survival into something faintly savory. But when hands needed food that could travel, flat, fast, and fireproof, oats became the answer. Meal 9. Oat cakes, bread for the journey. When ovens were a luxury and wheat was taxed into the sky, Peasants made oat cakes, a flatbread cooked on hot stones or griddles over the fire. Oats, water, and a bit of ash salt were mixed into a rough dough and pressed flat. They cooked quickly and stored well, perfect for field work or travel. Hard, chewy, and slightly smoky, oat cakes were often carried into the fields, tucked into belts, or wrapped in cloth. A knight had his sword. A peasant had his oat cake, simple, sturdy, and ever at his side. They broke with a snap and left crumbs in every fold of cloth. Some were eaten cold and dry, others softened in broth. They bore no crust, no fluff, just grit and grain. Still, when your hands were blistered and the sun was cruel, a pocket oat cake was salvation. But not every meal was fire-cooked or field-packed. Some were picked straight from the forest floor and eaten with both caution and reverence. Meal 10. Wild herb salad, the green gamble. In the warmer months, peasants gathered wild greens, dandelion leaves, sorrel, purslane, chickweed, wood sorrel, and plantain. Washed and eaten raw, or lightly wilted, these made a kind of salad that was bitter, sharp, and medicinal. There were dangers, too. One wrong leaf could mean poison. Knowledge passed through mothers and midwives kept villages safe. No oil, no vinegar, just greens, sometimes tossed with curds or a crumbled crust of cheese. It was a medicine as much as a meal. The taste? Astringent. Alive, like biting into the forest floor. Sometimes a little ash salt was added, or a chopped boiled egg if a hen had been kind. These herbs fought scurvy, eased bowels, and kept teeth in mouths. To a noble, it was weeds. To a peasant, it was life from the earth's very skin. And when the herbs faded and the rains returned, it was back to the oven, or what passed for one, for the bread of the poor. Meal 11. Black bread, the loaf of the lowborn. Made with coarse rye, barley, or whatever flour could be spared, black bread was the foundation of the peasant table. Baked in communal ovens or hearthside coals, these loaves were dense, dark, and sour from long fermentation or poor grain. Sometimes even tree bark was ground in during famine years. Still, bread was sacred. The church taught it was Christ's flesh. Peasants crossed loaves before slicing them. No crumb was wasted. It scraped the mouth and filled the gut, and yet no meal felt whole without it. Ash sometimes blackened the crust, and the crumb was often wet in the center. It smelled of smoke and sour air. Some peasants softened it in broth. Others simply chewed until their jaws ached. But it stayed longer in the stomach than words or wine, and that made it holy. But every so often, when the orchard and garden aligned, the poor crafted something with a touch of sweetness, if only for a day. Meal 12. Apple and cabbage bake. Sweet meets sour. Rare was the day a peasant had both fruit and fire enough for such a dish, but when autumn gave apples and the field still bore cabbage, something special could be made. Thin slices of apple layered with cabbage, salt, and sometimes a bit of lard or dried bread, baked slowly in the embers. The result? A sweet-sour tangle of flavor, warm and fragrant. It wasn't dessert, it wasn't stew. It was hope in a pot, a moment of flavor in a life of sameness. The dish filled the room with a smell that made even the weary pause. Children would sit near the hearth just to breathe it in. Some added crushed mustard seeds for sharpness, others a scrap of sausage grease if it could be spared. One night of warmth, one bowl of grace. But sweet things were rare and never lasted. Most days, the poor chewed on what curdled, cracked, or stank, and made meals from what others tossed aside. Meal 13. Curdled milk and cheese scraps. The cow's mercy. Fresh milk was a rare luxury for peasants, and when it soured, it wasn't thrown away. It became food. Curdled milk, lumpy and sharp, was strained and salted, turned into soft cheese, or eaten as is. When real cheese hardened or molded, it was grated, soaked, or scraped. Nothing was wasted. This wasn't the creamy cheese of a noble's platter. It was coarse, pungent, and barely solid. In some villages, peasants would wrap curds in cloth and hang them near the fire, drying them to stretch their life. Others buried cheese in ash to preserve it, scraping off rot when needed. Children were given curds with bread crusts. Shepherds packed hardened cheese for the road. A single cow, shared between families, was a lifeline. Its milk becoming a dozen things, none of them wasted. A nobleman's rot was a peasant's feast. From spoil came sustenance, and from sourness, strength. And when the rivers thawed and the manor kitchen tossed out the scraps, peasants found new nourishment, with eyes that stared back. Meal 14, fish head stew, the river's leftovers. While the nobility dined on fresh-caught trout and golden-fried eel, peasants scavenged the remains. Fish heads, bones, and offal, cleaned, boiled, and stewed into fish head soup. It began with river scraps, or what the Lord's kitchens discarded. Onion, nettle, barley, or sorrel were thrown in to build flavor. The eyes, cheeks, and jaw meat were picked clean with calloused fingers. The broth? Murky and oily, but filling. The smell lingered for days, sharp, briny, earthy. Children slurped it eagerly, licking their fingers for the last taste of fat. The lucky ones found a full cheek or a soft piece of cartilage to chew. In coastal villages, herring heads and cod trimmings were stewed in seawater with seaweed and thistle. Inland carp and pike heads ruled the pot. No part was wasted. Where lords feasted on the flesh, peasants boiled the bones. But in that broth was all the sea could still offer. And when neither fish nor firewood could be had, they turned once more to the earth, digging up a meal that grew beneath fallen leaves and old roots. Meal 15, hazelnut and root paste. Foraged strength. In autumn, peasants turned to the woods. Hidden among the leaves were hazelnuts, chestnuts, and edible roots, carrots, wild parsnips, and burdock. When ground and mashed with water or animal fat, they formed a dense, nutty paste, roughly the texture of porridge, but far richer in energy. Hazelnuts were cracked with stones, and roots roasted in the embers before mashing. Mixed together, they made a meal high in oil, perfect for cold months when fat was scarce. If salt was available, or a bit of cheese scrap, it was stirred in. If not, the paste was eaten as is, pressed into balls for later. This was a meal of the forest. Nourishing, fibrous, slightly sweet. Some peasants even traded hazelnuts for bread in lean winters. From root and shell, the forest gave its hidden treasure. Bite by bite, the peasant endured. But food did not always come kindly. Sometimes it crawled inside your bread, and you ate it anyway. Meal 16, weevil, bread. Bite carefully. When times were worst, bread still came, but not untouched. Weevils, small beetles that infested stored flour, often riddled loaves baked by the poor. Peasants ate around them, or didn't bother at all. These were loaves of barley or rye, their crusts blackened by hearth coals, their interiors dotted with holes and insects. Weevils were sometimes picked out, sometimes just crunched with the bite. If the loaf was moldy, it was toasted on the coals. If stale, soaked in broth or goat's milk. Either way, it was eaten. Waste was not an option. In the eyes of the hungry, even bread with legs was better than no bread at all. Children grew used to the bitter taste. Elders said, "You've eaten worse in your dreams." It wasn't just bread. It was a lesson. That hunger rewrites your idea of what's edible, and survival leaves no room for pride. And when bread turned your stomach, you looked for something fresher, something red, sour, and pulled from the soil before the frost took it. Meal 17, beetroot and vinegar slop, red for the poor. When gardens gave beets, peasants rejoiced, for the root gave bulk, and the leaves fed goats. Boiled beets were chopped and mixed with stale vinegar, often homemade from spoiled wine or cider, and served warm or cold. The result was a slop, bright red, tangy, and surprisingly filling. On feast days or weddings, some even added onions, eggs, or curdled milk, but most days, it was beets, vinegar, and spoon. This dish came from Eastern Europe but spread westward through border villages and traveling serfs. Its color alone made it feel festive, even when the taste was sharp and sour. Children stained their fingers red. Some swore it gave strength, others just ate and moved on. The meal was simple, the meaning wasn't. But when all the jars were empty and even the vinegar had gone cloudy, fire itself became a source of sustenance. Meal 18. Boiled grain with ash salt. Fire's harvest. When herbs ran dry and true salt was too dear, peasants used ash salt, a substitute made by burning salt-rich plants like marsh samphire or kelp and leaching their ashes in boiling water. This briny liquid seasoned the most basic of foods, boiled grain. Wheat, rye, or barley, boiled until swollen and soft, was ladled into bowls and drizzled with the dark, smoky ash water. It gave depth, if not delight. Ash salt was harsh on the tongue, but it preserved. The grain itself often stuck together in clumps, requiring fingers to break it apart. Yet it filled the belly and flavored the day. From fire and ash, the peasant coaxed salt, and in that salt, the will to endure. Fireside ashes were sifted with care. Whole villages relied on one family's leaching pot. To the outsider, it tasted burnt. To the desperate, it tasted like something. But when ferment met fire, a different kind of miracle appeared, stored in jars, sharp on the tongue, and vital for winter. Meal 19. Fermented cabbage, the sour savior. Fresh vegetables did not last, but cabbage, when sliced, salted, and packed in clay crocks, became fermented cabbage, known in some places as sauerkraut. Its sharp tang was both a taste and a remedy. Peasants learned to preserve harvests with nothing more than salt and thyme. The cabbage would bubble and hiss as it soured, kept in cellars and dugouts for winter months. Eaten cold or warmed in a pot, it helped digestion, staved off scurvy, and added flavor to otherwise bland fare. It was common in Germanic lands, but versions existed all across Europe, from Slavic picklings to Norse barrels. Where the world turned gray, sour cabbage brought a bite of life and the memory of summer fields. The smell was unmistakable, vinegary, vegetal, alive. Children often wrinkled their noses, but their mothers said, "Eat, and your teeth will hold through winter." It was survival with a sting, but if the garden gave life, the pig gave glory, and what was left behind after the nobility feasted, peasants turned into their own harvest. Meal 20. Pig trotters and offal, the butcher's mercy. The Lord took the haunch, the reeve took the ribs. What was left for the village were pig trotters, ears, lungs, and stomach, the unwanted parts. And yet these became rich stew, boiled long and seasoned with mustard seed or vinegar to cut the fat. Feet were scraped and boiled until the skin turned gelatinous. Livers were chopped and fried in fat, if there was any. Tripe was washed again and again until chewable. These were not delicacies. They were burdens turned edible. Where others saw waste, the poor carved a feast with iron will and boiling water. On feast days, whole stews of offal were made, served with black bread and onion broth. The textures were strange, but the fat was gold. For some, it was the only time the year tasted like meat, but meat was rare and fleeting. Most days, the poor relied on yesterday's meal, reshaped, reheated, reborn into something barely new. Meal 21. Cold porridge cakes. Yesterday's meal reborn. Nothing was thrown away. Not even yesterday's porridge. Cold barley or oat porridge was shaped into flat cakes and either reboiled or seared on stones until firm. These were porridge cakes, often carried to the fields as midday meals. Sometimes honey or dried berries were folded in. More often, they were eaten plain, gritty, and cool to the touch. They were easy to store, easier to stomach, and filled the gap between hunger and hard labor. In Wales and the North, these cakes became tradition. In other lands, they were forgotten as fast as they were eaten. The cakes were dull in flavor but rich in memory. You could hold the week's struggle in your hands, and if the cakes were gone and the weeds were back, the pot returned to boiling leaves and wild roots once more. Meal 22. Boiled weeds and garlic. The bitter boil. There were seasons when even onions were gone. In those days, peasants gathered what they could. Docks, thistles, cleavers, wild garlic, and boiled them into bitter greens. The pot stank, the flavor burned, but the result was nourishing. Garlic and wild leeks were used to mask the harsh taste. If bread was available, it was dunked in, softening the bitterness. If not, it was simply endured. Some plants wounded the mouth, others the pride, but boiled together, they kept death outside the door. Villagers passed down knowledge of what weeds cured and what killed. The wrong root meant illness. The right one meant another season survived. But now and then, the gods of Greece smiled, and fat was turned into flame-kissed cakes. Meal 23. Tallow cakes. Grease and grit. In times of celebration, or when a butcher's fat could be bartered, peasants made tallow cakes, a mix of flour, water, and rendered animal fat, pan-fried into golden, greasy rounds. There was no sugar, no spices, just smoke, sizzle, and heat. These cakes were eaten hot from the stone, dripping fat and steam. They were rare, and often reserved for the first days after slaughter, when the tallow was fresh. For one fleeting meal, the mouth forgot bitterness, and tasted fire and flesh. The cakes left grease on hands, lips, even clothes, but they filled the belly and lifted the mood. For a brief hour, the poor ate like kings without knowing it, and when there was no meat, no grain, and barely a fire, one humble egg could become a treasure in the ashes. Meal 24. Egg in ashes. A fire pit feast. When a hen laid and the family was lucky enough to have spared the egg, it was not boiled. It was buried in ash, cooked slow in embers. The ash-baked egg took on a smoky flavor, its shell darkened, its yolk rich and dense. It was eaten whole, with salt if possible, or crumbled onto bread or porridge. Children fought over the soft middle. Parents gave up their share. It was a single bite of gold in a gray world. This was no daily food. This was gift, event, and miracle, all cracked into one brittle shell. But even miracles leave dregs, and in those dregs, the poor found their final meal. Meal 25. Mead lees and barley crust. The brewer's scrap. The last meal on this list is not truly a meal, but a byproduct of another's pleasure. The lees left at the bottom of a mead barrel, fermented dregs of honey, yeast, and sediment. Mixed with barley crusts, or mashed into porridge, it gave a sour, yeasty flavor, and a faint warmth. Sometimes, it even made children giggle or stumble. Even in the shadow of another man's feast, the poor found something to eat, and something to feel. Villagers would scrape the brewer's barrels, trade favors for a bucket of lees, and stir it into grain with reverence. It was bitterness turned into fuel, warmth, and, if only for a moment, a taste of joy. These meals were not crafted for taste. They were forged in fire and famine, stirred with hands blistered by labor, and eaten with eyes turned to the sky in thanks, or in silence. They are forgotten now, swept away by golden cookbooks and powdered banquets. But once, they kept the world alive. This was the table of the peasant, and this was how they endured.